There is much to talk about. Let's get straight to our panel. Joining us from Portland in Oregon is Liang. She's an associate professor at Willamette University. Therese Hesketh joins us from London. She is director of the Center for Global Health at Zhejiang University School of Medicine. Joining us here in Washington is Richard Jackson. He's the president of the Global Aging Institute. And joining us from Chapel Hill in North Carolina is Yong. He's an assistant professor with the Department of Sociology at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Thank you to all of you for joining us. Yong, let me start with you. As we've just heard, China's population is expected to peak at 1.4 billion in 2029 before going into a decline, an unstoppable decline, as we've been hearing. How does one explain this decrease in China's population, given that it eased its one-child policy several years ago?
Okay, a couple of points. That first, the decline is set in motion actually since 1970 because the cohort has been shrinking, relatively speaking, to the previous generation. So when the fertility dropped below replacement in 1990, China's cohort size dropped from roughly 26 million to 18 million in very few years. And that set in motion with those born in the late 1980s and 1990s now in the reproductive age, that we only can expect them to have a smaller cohort size down the road. So that the declining process has been set in motion for a long time.
So Richard, as we're hearing, this was set in motion a long time. By 2050, 330 million Chinese are expected to be over the age of 65. What kind of impact will that have on China in general, and especially on the Chinese economy?
Well, first of all, I think, when we talk about the aging of the population, it's important to understand that there are two drivers. The first driver is the falling birth rate, which we were just talking about. People are having fewer babies, and this decreases the relative number of young in the population. The second driver is rising life expectancy. And both of these drivers together increase the elderly share of the population. So the first big economic impact of the aging of the population, understood as the shift in the age structure, is slower GDP growth. Okay. Because slower growth in the working age population, and indeed a contraction in the working age population, all other things being equal, translates into a commensurate decline in GDP growth. And indeed, China's already seeing that. The second is the increase in the old age dependency burden. That's the ratio of the old to the working age population. Graying means paying. Right? It means paying more for pensions, more for health care, more for long-term care for the frail elderly. The old age dependency ratio, right, of the retired elderly to working age adults is due to triple in China over the next generation. All other things being equal, the cost of supporting the elderly will triple. So even as economic growth is slowing, workers will have to transfer a rising share of their income, whether through government budgets or through the family, to the elderly. And I think what makes this especially challenging in China is that there is an enormous expectation, as revealed in a survey the Global Aging Institute did a few years ago, that it will be government that supports the elderly, not the individual through savings, not the family, but government. So government needs to step up and fill in that gap, and it's beginning to its credit.
Okay, let's go to Therese Hesketh. She's in London. And Therese, of course, behaviors are changing, not just in China, but throughout the world. Attitudes are changing among young people as well. Let's listen to the views of some young Chinese. Let's watch this.
没有特别喜欢吧，我觉得自己开心最重要了。
不一定。
为什么呢？
养孩子有点累啊。
孩子肯定是要生的呀。
你还是觉得要生的？
家里就我一个，我这不得传宗接代吗？
早点晚点都一样，但是孩子肯定很重要。
So, Therese, there we heard young Chinese telling us, some of them telling us that they don't plan on getting married because they value what they call their freedom or their status as single people. Others saying, yes, they do want to get married, they do want to have children. So varied opinions. What kind of pressure do young people in China now face to marry and have more children?
it's still very much an imperative for the vast majority of Chinese. Women particularly, women and men, but boys, they all want to get married. And I think the people you're talking to there on camera are actually an exception, quite a small exception. And the imperative for marriage is still very high. And by the time a woman in particular hits around 30, she's getting worried that she won't marry. I think the pressure, particularly for children, at the moment still comes from grandparents. And you come across many young people in China who will say they actually don't care about having children, but their parents want them to have children. And that grandparental role in terms of childcare is very dominant in Chinese culture.
Right.
And so I think that's a very important, for Chinese young people, that's a very important factor.
Right, and Therese, as you point out, some women, when they reach the age of 30, start getting worried. There's also a bit of a social stigma attached to that, isn't there? People very derisively known as leftover women.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I know many girls going into their late 20s who are absolutely don't sleep at night worrying about this. I'm not exaggerating. This is a very major thing for most Chinese. It's still an issue. In the kind of very trendy parts of Shanghai, Beijing, and so on, there is a kind of small move towards people saying, "Oh, I don't want to get married. I don't need children." But it's a very, very small number indeed.
Liang, for decades, China enforced its one-child policy. Of course, that was relaxed several years ago. We did see an 8% increase in births in 2016, but it fell to 3.5% in 2017. So is that a case of too little, too late?
Well, I think, yes, once the policy was relaxed, right, to allow people to have more children, then the people who really wanted to have more children would, rush to go ahead and do it. But I think the one-child policy was in place for a reason. And when it was implemented back in the late 1970s, China was faced with rising population and resources constraint. And I think that policy was in place for the right reason, right, in that specific context. But as Dr. Karen Tsai put it, development is the best contraceptive. So as China advanced into the middle-income country status, then families are taking, proactively the family planning measures, and so that policy became obsolete. And also, as you point out, with the labor shortages, China needed to revamp its policy. Now, I don't think it's sort of too little and too late, but as your first speaker pointed out, there are very specific demographics reasons and also social, cultural, and economic reasons for why women and families in general don't want to have children or have more than one child. So I think that's why it's important for the government to continue pursue policies to encourage birth rates, to improve labor productivity, to provide more sort of technological development, and all of these to overcome, the labor shortages issues.
Right, Liang, when you talk of family planning, what do those family planning policies advocate? What do they advise people to do?
Well, in the past, of course, is trying to make sure that there's no overpopulation, there's not too much rapid population growth. Right, when the policy was implemented in 1979, China has just experienced a very rapid population growth. From 1949, they were about 540 million population, and by the time 1979, that number increased to 940 million. So less than 30 years, the population almost doubled. So in the past, the idea is that we wanted to have quality child raising, childbearing experience. We don't want to just go for the numbers. But now I think the idea is that families are encouraged to have 2 children. But again, there are all these different reasons for why families don't want to have children early or have more than one child. So I think for the government, one very important measure to encourage childbirth is to provide affordable childcare, education, improve gender equality in the labor market, and so on. So all these would be good supplemental policies to encourage childbirth and family planning.
All right, let me go back to Yong in Chapel Hill. Yong, we are also seeing in China marriage registrations on the decline and divorces actually rising in the country. Many single people tell us that they enjoy their status as singles. Now, in a society like China, which places so much emphasis on the family unit, how did this change? What drove that change?
So there are a couple of things. First, I think I want to make a small correction to Therese's point that there are only a small fraction of people not getting married or delaying their marriage. In Shanghai, about a quarter of college-educated remain unmarried by age 30. So that's not a small number. And the main reason is Chinese are just like everybody else in this world. They have all kinds of priorities. They own career, they own leisure activities, and the other part of this is actually grandparents are now less helpful than previous generation in helping raising the third generation. I have a couple of friends. The grandparents told them, say, hey, if you want to have a second child, you be on your own. I'm not going to help. I already contributed mine. I have to enjoy my own retirement life, or I have enjoy other priorities.
Okay, Therese, go ahead.
I just want to say I think Shanghai is very, very different to most of China. I spent a lot of time in rural China and in the central parts of China, Western China. I think we're not, these are very different places. And I think, I agree, I work in Hangzhou. Hangzhou is very like Shanghai. There are many people in their waiting till they're over 30 to get married, but many of them will get married eventually. The other thing I just wanted to pick up was Richard's point about the people expecting the government to cover their elderly care.
Right.
And I just say in places like, in fact, in Zhejiang province, a new insurance has just been introduced, which goes along with healthcare insurance, which will allow for people to save for care in their old age. And this is very new in China. And I think what it does show is the government's very, very aware of this problem of how the elderly will be cared for in the future when they now, as you said, as Richard said, they are depending on the government or expecting the government to help them as they get older.
That's absolutely correct. When I first studied the problem or the challenge of old age security in China in a report called The Graying of the Middle Kingdom back in 2004, pension coverage was extremely low. Dependence on the extended family was almost universal outside of the big urban centers. And over the past 5-6 years in particular, the government has made enormous strides in extending old age security through the new rural pension system and the pension system for migrant workers. I believe the figure is mind-boggling. 300 to 400 million newly covered workers in these two pension systems over the past 5 or 6 years.
China can do it.
Yeah,
right.
Remarkable.
But there's a limit, how much government can do, as Richard had just pointed out, that the number is mind-boggling. So many people getting into retirement age, and by our own, our own recent calculation, the projection is if China moved to the OECD's average level of pension and healthcare coverage, that by 2050 it will eat the entire government revenue, 30% of GDP.
But let me put this bluntly, if I may. In effect, the government asked people not to have children or to have just one, and implied that it would substitute for the traditional system of family support. I think the government is acutely aware that it needs to hold up that end of the bargain, which is why it's moving so forcefully and consistently to expand the social safety net. But you're absolutely right. You can't go to the OECD average level. There isn't the money.
Right, Therese, if we look at some of the other pressures that Chinese parents face, we know that Chinese parents are among the most competitive in the world. They want their best for their children. But that puts a lot of pressure on their resources. And does that perhaps act as a bit of a brake on the fact that they might want to have 2 kids, but they don't want to divide those resources?
I think that's absolutely right. I think there's a major, the competitiveness in Chinese education system, in Chinese society in general, is very severe. And I think people talk about the one-child policy, and one of the advantages of the one-child policy for those children was that all the resources within the family was spent on the one child, and that gave those children great opportunities, particularly for women, in fact, particularly for females. And so many girls benefited greatly from being only children. If they'd had a brother, resources might have gone preferentially to the boy. And so many women have benefited greatly from that. But it is huge. I think competitiveness in Chinese society, as in many other countries now, of course, is a huge barrier to having more children.
Yang Liang, there is also, of course, the fact that China has tens of millions more men than women. There's a figure that we saw that there will be 24 million single men of marrying age will be unable to find wives in China. What would be the consequences of that?
Right. So one of the reasons for removing the one-child policy and replace it with a two-child policy is to address this, sex imbalance. So one of the biggest problem, of course, is the gender imbalances and the difficulty to getting marriage and so on. So I think the idea, even when the one-child policy was implemented, there was addendum over the years to allow, for example, rural couples, if their first child is a girl, then they're allowed to have a second child. So the idea is to reduce, female fetus infanticide and so on and so forth. So I think with this two-child policy, the idea is that people may be able to give birth to two children and help to balance that sort of unbalanced gender ratio.
Right, Richard, you were telling us a moment ago of the impact this would have on the Chinese economy, but China being really a driver of international trade, I mean, it's a major trading partner with dozens of countries, it's going to affect the world, isn't it?
Well, sure. But it's important to put things in perspective. When we're talking about an economic slowdown in China, we're talking about growth in GDP slowing from 10% per year to about 6 or 7% now, potentially to 3 or 4%, maybe to 2% within the next decade or so. So barring some near-term miscalculation, a trade war gone awry off the tracks, this should be a more or less gradual transition. And much of the rest of the world will be slowing as well. So the challenge for policymakers is to ensure that things don't go off the rails.
Yong, there are many people who compare China's demographic challenges, the ones that they're facing right now, to that faced by Japan in the 1990s. Do you see many similarities?
There's a clear parallel between China and Japan, but I'm not an economist to start with, but I think it's naive to simply link, Japan's so-called lost decades or last 2 decades to its demographic problem. At least, from what I read, many economists agree that, at least, for example, the aging in the United States is economically neutral. Its effect on economic growth is not there. So, yes, I can say the parallel, demographically speaking, but drawing the connection beyond the demography is a little bit, out of my area, at least.
Therese, one other question, and, looking at some of the positive effects of what the one-child policy or current demographic policies in China have done, would it be fair to say that it's empowered women in China? I mean, if you look at some of the figures, women are responsible for 41% of China's GDP, more women at university now than men, and 80% of the millionaires, female millionaires that were created last year were Chinese women.
No, I think that's one of the benefits of the policy, and say many women have benefited directly from being only girls in a family, and that has enabled them to really fulfill educational expectations which would have been unthinkable 50 years ago. The number of women in education and also going to universities abroad. In America, there are many girls attending expensive universities, and parents are able to pay for that because they are single children.
Right, Yan Liang, what do you make of that? It has been good for women, hasn't it?
Yes. I mean, in general, we see this trend not only in China, but let's say in the United States, right? More women attend college than boys. But in China, because of the cultural constraints, a lot of times, resources typically are given to boys first before women, so before girls. So I think, yes, being the only child in the family, I think girls do get, more resources than otherwise would have been the case.
Richard, the United Nations has been looking at this in China, and one of its officials in China says that the solution is not to simply encourage couples to have more children. It says the government needs to step in, create more high-quality childcare services, for instance, so that people can have it both ways. They can have a career and they can have children.
Well, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, first of all, it's important to understand that low fertility isn't a uniquely Chinese problem. Right. Right? The birth rates come down in most of the emerging world. And it's beneath replacement throughout East Asia, the only exception being Mongolia, the last time I checked. And in many countries, it's far beneath China. Now, if we look at attitudinal data when women are polled about how many children that ideally like to have, in China, the answer varies somewhere, depending on the survey, between 1.6 and 1.8. So China's at the low end, right, of this ideal fertility range. That means there's a potential to raise that through the right policy responses. And the single most important response would be precisely what you say. The experience of other countries around the world, particularly in developed economies, points out the critical importance of work-family balance, and enabling young people, but especially women, to do both things that they need and in general want to do, to have a job and to have a family. So
Therese,
absolutely.
Right, Therese, Hesketh, have you come across that? I mean, where have these policies really worked, this work-family balance?
I would say one of the problems is that they haven't worked in many places. Pronatal policies sound very good on paper, but they often don't work. Japan's a good example of this. The Japanese have got very strong pronatal policies and actually have had very little. They have a marginal effect on the birth rate. I think the first thing the Chinese have to do is lift the policy anyway completely, end of, The policy has to be removed as a starting point, and I don't quite understand why they are persisting still. There is talk it's because the number of people who work in the family planning sector, about 500,000 of them, who need to be redeployed, and it's simply a logistic problem because the number of people involved in the whole family planning structure. But that needs to be done first, and then because they say there are still cases of people having third children who are being penalized for it. Because you need to encourage people to have 3, 4 children. There are people who will, but while they're not allowed to, of course they won't. And so you get a balance between small families and larger families. In the longer term, that is a possibility in China.
Liang, there are other things that the Chinese government is considering. One of those things is to introduce laws that would protect a woman's right to employment, on the one hand, and on the other hand, it will also penalize employers who discriminate against pregnant women. Where do you see that going?
I think this is very important. I think, gender inequality in the labor market is pretty much everywhere. The laws are there, but the enforcement is often lacking. You always see those job posts that says, male only or female only at the very young age. If you're older than 35, then you're not being considered. So I would say, the motherhood penalty in China is a lot more evidence than, what the laws would allow. So I think it's important to pass laws to protect women. China does have very generous, maternity leave, for example, of 98 days, I believe. But still, I think a lot of the employers are discriminating women, based on their age, based on their, status, and so on. So I think, yes, that would be helpful for women to be more incentivized to bear children and raise children.
Yong, one final question, and that is, China is expected to be the world's biggest economy very soon. In fact, by some measures, it is already the world's biggest economy. But is there a risk that it's going to get older before it gets richer?
It is already getting old, and yes, China is, economically growing fast, but I think the trajectory is slowing down, probably at 5-6% rate, but the aging is going to be much faster than economic growth. That's a sad fact, and I would like to join Therese to call the Chinese government to scrap all the restrictions and to do away this birth planning policy. I think it's a misnomer to translate it as family planning, because it is not a family planning, it's a birth planning. It's the government meddling people's choice.
And that's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.